Good afternoon, colleagues, friends, and everyone who has joined today from wherever you are in the world. I'm very pleased to be able to invite you to this Climate Mind Connection webinar, where we're going to be unpacking the question how climate change affects our mental health. We are going to be together now for approximately 2 hours, and we have an excellent lineup of three speakers who I will introduce before they speak. But just by way of introduction, to say that I am Cara D. I work at the South African Medical Research Council. I'm based in Pretoria, South Africa, and I lead a climate and health research program. So, climate change and health impacts is one of the most important parts of my work, together with air pollution impacts on health. And when it comes to climate impacts, one of the ones that are most overlooked pertain to mental health and well-being. And I think more focus is slowly being turned to this overlooked health impacts, especially in South Africa, where we have been seeing an increase in extreme weather events. And while we hear reports on the news of drownings or people being lost in floods and other physical impacts, the indirect impact, especially that of our impact on mental health, is very seldom mentioned or even thought about. So I'm very pleased that the Academy of Science of South Africa, in partnership with the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation, have put together this webinar today for us to hear more from some fantastic speakers. So I won't take much longer than that. I think that's a good start. And I would like to introduce our first speaker today, who's Miss Caroline Hickman. She's a psychotherapist, a lecturer, and a researcher all the way from the University of Bath in the United Kingdom, which is a really beautiful town. And Miss Hickman has an extensive experience in social work and has been working since joining the university in Bath on looking at the relationships between young people's emotional health and well-being and emotional responses to things that are changing in the environment. So without waiting any further, I would like to hand over to Ms. Hickman for our very first presentation of the webinar.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to join you today in this event. It's so lovely to be involved, and it's so important. So I really want to echo what you just said. So, yes, I have a background in social work and also in psychotherapy. So I'm going to be talking about the climate mental health impact on children and young people specifically. My research is primarily with children and young people, but my clinical work in psychotherapy is also with adults. And to be honest, when I present this material, adults say to me afterwards, yes, but we feel very similarly. So there is an absolute correlation, if you like, a connection, not just between climate and mind, but also between generations and between different countries as well. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. So I'm not going to read through every slide, I absolutely promise you, but there's a couple of things to pick out, and I'll share the slides later. Just a couple of things to create a framing for what I'm going to be talking about in a minute in terms of children. We need to look in terms of mental health in direct impact, flooding, heat waves, air pollution, absolutely. But also indirect impact. And indirect impact is often very, very significant for countries in the global north where you may not be facing so much direct impact yet. They certainly are in some ways. South Africa is very different. There's much more direct impact, but direct and indirect are both important. We also need to look at long and short-term impact, and that's particularly important when it comes to children and young people's mental health, because it has a long-term impact as a stressor on their mental health, which can potentially be for the whole of their lives. I also want to give you a caveat and say, I do apologize. I do and I don't. I'm talking about really difficult, emotionally difficult, painful things. And I think we would all comfortably say we want a good future for our children and young people across the world. And I'm very aware as I speak about some of these things that I'm talking about some of those difficulties, and that's my job and it's painful. So I want to acknowledge that. In terms of specifics in mental health, we're looking at a number of things: climate anxiety, which I'll define more in detail in a moment, vicarious trauma, as well as direct trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, although the philosopher Timothy Morton would argue that it's also pre-traumatic stress disorder, the anticipation of wildfires and flooding, and complicated grief. The reason it's complicated is because it's not natural disasters that we're facing. In terms of trauma and traumatic recovery, I'm generalizing a little bit, but recovery from natural disasters psychologically can be more straightforward than psychological recovery from the grief that we feel in relation to climate change. Why is this so different? Because it's human caused. And because if it's human caused, humans can also prevent it. So it complicates the grief that we feel. UNICEF publish regular figures on this. If we look at the Children's Climate Risk Index, which is the combination of things, respiratory health conditions, alongside air pollution, alongside risk factors for mental health difficulties, in 2021, they estimated 1 billion children were at extremely high risk as a result. So to understand the impact in terms of mental health, we have to look at stress vulnerability models of health. This chronic stress in childhood, which our children are being exposed to, has this long-lasting impact, which then impacts on mental health in adolescence and adulthood. Just to give you a couple more figures, I'm sure you know that mental health difficulties are in the top 10 leading causes of disease burden worldwide. We're looking also, particularly in adults, about increased rates of suicide and domestic abuse. Although we do have very, very small numbers, thankfully, I fear that it will increase. We already have specific cases of suicide from teenagers, young people, both in the UK and the US, directly in relation to despair about climate change. Again, my caveat, my apology, this never good news from me. If we think it's just older children, I'm afraid it's not. A YouGov survey that I designed and developed with Greenpeace in 2023 examined how younger children felt, ages 6 to 12. Because we often think that younger children are not as impacted because they're more protected by the parents, or they don't talk about it so much and they're not being educated in school. In terms of psychological health, 78% were worried, 27% very worried. It's a small sample, it's a survey, but I think those figures tell us a great deal. That my qualitative research through the university is with children as young as 4 and 5. Obviously, cognitively, they're not fully developed in terms of developing a full understanding of this, but that does not mean they're not impacted in some way. They're part of the world in the same way as we would not dream of not talking to our young children about illness or disability within the family. You can apply the same thinking to things like climate change. In fact, they worry more if we don't. So I want to define more clearly, from my perspective, what do we mean by the mental health impact and eco-anxiety in particular in relation to children and young people. Now, when I started this research, I thought climate anxiety is anxiety in relation to climate change. It's logical, right? We see what's happening in the world and we feel anxious, we feel distressed. But the more I talked with children and young people, and I've talked with hundreds all over the world, the more I started to realize that I was hearing narratives, I was hearing an experience that more closely aligned with the narrative that I heard from children and young people who had been hurt or abused or betrayed, either in their families or in school, by systemic injustice, refugees, asylum seekers. there was a common narrative. I'm not saying it's exactly the same. I don't think you can argue that, but there's something similar. So I started to rethink my understanding of climate anxiety. And I thought, well, it's not just anxiety about the planet. And children said this to me clearly over and over again. They said we would feel okay, well, not okay, but we would feel better about it if the adults were taking action, if our governments, plural, were taking action. No matter what your politics, it's a global, political, social, psychological issue. So I started to understand it slightly differently, not just in relation to climate change, but also as a relational betrayal trauma, a form of moral injury, which has been well researched with veterans coming back from war or with doctors struggling with health services, but there's a failure to take care of the population. And there's a kind of betrayal in the way we communicate about it globally, a kind of attempt to reassure people. But children, they have a capacity, don't they, to see through what we say to them half the time. And the evidence that they see and the way they feel about their futures does not always match up with the way adults can reassure themselves. Children have not developed adult defenses. Children have not learnt that the world, well, obviously some have, that the world is unfair, but we can still survive. They can internalize it and personalize it profoundly. They can also form deep empathic connection, not just with children all over the world, but also with the plight of others, animals, who are suffering because of climate change, and it's not their fault. So there's an identification for children because it's not their fault either. So I started to understand that climate anxiety in children was subtly different to the way adults could frame it. And it was not just about climate. I hope I'm not boring you by kind of laboring this point. But for me, it's just really important to understand that it's rather different for children and young people, and that we need to see it through the lens of their eyes, their understanding, that they are relatively powerless, they've not caused it, but they are facing some of the worst impact of it, especially when we think about that long term. The other thing to be clear about is climate anxiety, eco anxiety, is actually a mentally healthy response to what's going on in the world. It's not a pathology, it's not a mental illness. Anxiety in the Western medical model, we would see anxiety as problematic, we'd want to treat it and remove it. The problem when it comes to climate change is if we remove the anxiety, we're actually saying to children, you shouldn't feel worried about a world that is worrying. And that's even more convoluted and confusing for them because their fear and their anxiety is actually congruent and healthy. So that would not work for them. It doesn't reduce their anxiety. In fact, it makes it worse because it doesn't make sense to them. So it's actually healthy. So my way of communicating with children and young people about that, because it's not okay to just say, oh, it's a mentally healthy response, but you're suffering. We have to do something about their struggle and their suffering. And we have to speak to that and support that. I wouldn't want to treat it because it's not a mental illness, but I certainly think we have to understand it and support it. And some of that is a psychoeducational approach. I'm sure we can talk more about this later. I usually say to children, listen, you feel this distress or this anxiety because you care about the planet. You care about what's happening around the world. You should feel proud that you care. So I want to reframe the anxiety with them. Now, I'm slightly worried that I'm going to be talking too long, so I'm going to speed up a little bit because I want to give you some numbers. I've tried to differentiate between mild feelings of anxiety, where there is a focus on optimism and hope, that's felt by the majority, but as those feelings become significantly worse, we lose capacity to trust others' ability to do something about it. And our defenses crumble psychologically. At its worst, at its most critical, people can become suicidal. There's a loss of capacity to feel safe in the world. It's not just anxiety, it is also depression, despair, anger, blame, frustration, guilt, grief, fantasies of rescue, nihilism. People cycle through all of these emotions. And I've tried to, again, to map that. I keep trying to model this to help people understand. And feel less insane with their despair, particularly when they're surrounded by people that maybe don't understand. It's often that lack of understanding from others that causes more mental health distress than the actual trigger itself. So I've tried to map it, and it's a hard argument to try and argue that depression and despair has its place in this journey, but it does, because otherwise we're just constantly trying to make people feel better about something, and they repeatedly feel anxious and then despairing. The benefit of feeling this trauma, this loss, this grief is that we can then build resilience, psychological resilience, move from eco anxiety to eco empathy, eco care. Feel grief. The grief is actually quite liberating in terms of, as humanity goes, we have messed up, we have made mistakes, and there is a lot we can do about it. So it's moving from a sort of naive hope to a radical hope. Things are bad, things are difficult, and there is a lot we can do. You can also frame this, particularly with children and young people, in terms of adverse childhood experiences. We can't run away from climate change. There is some degree to which it affects everywhere on the planet. And that global sensibility is really important. Children and young people, they have agency, but they don't have the resources. And that we can give them the resources with empathy and understanding and advocacy. So here's some examples of children's voices just to try and illustrate what I've been saying. And I promise you I will wrap up in the next 5 minutes. I've learnt a lot from listening to children and young people, and I just really want to include some of their voices. This is a young woman from the United States. She said to me last year, she said, I wish I was mad. I wish I was clinically insane. And I said to her, are you sure? Do you know what you're wishing for? And she said, well, she said, yeah. She said, because people would understand if I was mentally ill. They don't understand climate anxiety. Children frequently talk about care. Tell me how I should live in a world that doesn't care. Children want to live. A child in the Maldives said to me, he said, my friends are dying. He said, my friends, the fish, are dying. A 10-year-old boy in the UK, he said, it's okay for you. He was very cross with me, and I think he was quite right. This was when I was developing my understanding, which is still in development. It's an emergent issue. He said, it's okay for you. He said, you grew up thinking polar bears would be there forever. He said, I'm growing up knowing they will go extinct. It's not eco anxiety, it's eco terror. Why don't people care? Another child in the Maldives said to me, he said, climate change is like Thanos in the Avengers Endgame. He said his ideology was to kill off half the universe so the other half can thrive. He said, but we're the half being killed off. So, quickly, a few figures, and then I promise I will stop talking. So, this is research we published in 2021. It's a survey, 10,000 children across these 10 different countries, aged 16 to 25. Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, UK, US. And we wanted to look at three things. When we look at mental health impact on children and young people, there were three things particularly to look at before we talked about government and relationship. First, how is it impacting on your daily functioning? So, if we look at that dark purple line, impact on daily functioning, eating, sleeping, playing, going to school. India, 74%, Philippines, 74%, Nigeria, 66%, Brazil, 50%. The high end of direct physiological impact. So it helps us think about the physical mental health juxtaposition relationship. UK, 28%, much lower, still significant. But this becomes even more significant in a second. Let me show you. Emotionally, we talk about climate anxiety, but actually, the highest rated emotion was sadness, 67%. But talking about climate sadness doesn't have quite the same impact as climate anxiety. And young people have claimed it as a term for themselves, which I'm happy to encourage. Anybody talking about emotions, in my view, is great. But sadness and fear came before anxiety. I'm just picking out some of the key points. 8 out of 10 in that sample, 83% said people have failed to take care of the planet. But look, the UK is back up with the worldwide general figure. 92% Philippines, where you've got the direct impact as well. But the indirect impact, the UK is relatively okay at the moment, but young people here are still affected in terms of their mental health. So this is how we talk about climate emotions. I can be a woman possessed trying to get people to think about how young people think about climate change. It's not just feeling, but it's also thinking because of the way that impacts on your mental health. If you think the future is frightening, 75% worldwide figure. Look at the UK, 73%. So the young people in Europe, the US, they might be increasingly protected from the direct physical impact, but they're not protected from the cognitive impact, which means they're not protected from the mental health impact. Nigeria, they're 70%. The lowest is Finland, it's still over 50%. That's awful. Over half think humanity is doomed. 56% worldwide. What are we doing to our children and their mental health and their hope and optimism for the future if those percentages think humanity is doomed? They will internalize that and they will feel sad, despairing. Even worse, I told you I am awful to listen to. 48% said they were dismissed or ignored when they tried to talk about climate change. Now, this is bad news and good news. The bad news is half are dismissed or ignored. The good news is we could change that this afternoon. Collectively, we're not going to be able to stop climate change this afternoon, but we can help young people feel they're not alone with it by talking with them. It makes all the difference. We then asked about it in relation to governments, and this is the UK government figures. 65% of young people thought governments, plural. We were very careful to talk about plural governments so as not to signpost and blame an individual government. 65% thought governments, plural, were failing young people. 31% felt protected by governments. This is significant. This is the group of researchers from the United States, Canada, and across the UK and Finland. This group included psychologists, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, and young people, young activists. So for me, it's a mental health issue, but it's a human rights issue. By subjecting young people to climate anxiety and moral injury, it's cruel, inhuman, degrading, and a form of torture. And there's this intersection between the mental health, psychology, and the law. So, in short, I promise you, I'm finishing. In short, we need to talk about emotions, but also thinking and also action, doing. Science and facts needs to be balanced up with feelings, with attention to emotions. The University of Bath has me teaching this material to our engineering students. They come into the class thinking, why is this relevant? And then they start to understand. So here's the positives. These are the positive defenses that we can utilize and develop to help navigate this. We can't avoid it, can't get around it, but we can develop wisdom, resilience, emotional understanding and depth to navigate it. Emotional self-regulation, tolerance, self-talk, mindfulness, a little bit of humor, humility, gratitude for what we've still got. This is about our relationship with the planet. And then there is the possibility of reframing eco-anxiety to eco-empathy, compassion, courage, community, belonging. We can't get away from this, but we can turn it into something resilient. And this is the last thing I am going to say. When we published that research in 2021, I got emails from young people all over the world, which is astonishing and amazing. I was so privileged and honored. And I want to read you this one. She's given me permission, but her words are beautiful. Young people feel better when they have this understanding. She said, I'm only a single private person in Germany, but I want to thank you for the research. You get those moments in work, in life, where you think, oh, it's all worthwhile. This was that moment. She said, what the study reveals makes me, for the first time ever, feel I'm not alone with the future and the anxiety I experience every day. She said, I don't know where to go to get help. I gave her some ideas. This important study is an incredibly important step for us young people around the world to emotionally connect, and visually realize no one of us is alone with this huge issue. I profoundly hope the message of your study reaches politicians around the world, as well as socio-psychological professions, so they can react to the needs of us young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, if I may. That was such an such a powerful presentation and a reminder of how important EQ is in the climate change health discussion, and how I think, with the work that you and others are doing in this space, we're building the evidence that we need to really work towards solutions and interventions, and how we need to bring this onto the agenda. So thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I would, thanks. I would now like to invite our second speaker for today. And it is Mr. Thomas Kwame Nimu, who is a clinical health psychologist whose research bridges mental health and environmental change in West Africa. He holds advanced training in clinical health psychology and specializes in psychological capital, coping strategies, and distress among individuals affected by chronic illness and ecological disruptions. I'm very interested to learn too that through this clinical practice and research, he also works on informing mental health policy and intervention in settings vulnerable to climate shocks, emphasizing the emotional as well as the physical dimensions of climate change, which is a great next presentation for us to have following that of Ms. Hickman. So over to you, please, Thomas, if I may. I'll confirm when we can see your slides and when we can hear you.
Hi.
Hi, we can hear you. Your slides are up, but they are not in full screen mode.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Over to you.
Hi. Good morning. Hi. So I have an exciting presentation for you today. And then I titled it Global Climate and Local Resilience and Protecting Minds in a Changing Climate. And even though I have a short period with you, I'll try and run through a lot of concepts and a lot of things that I feel are important to this conversation. So we talk about the hidden crisis today of mental health in this whole climate conversation, and then we'll look at the Ghanaian lens, and then we'll take a couple of faces of distress, and also look at the healing approaches that exist for things for climate change emotions, and then the psychological capital framework, as well as a couple of community solutions and a call to action for all of us. So, as therapists, what we do is most of the time we sit at a vantage point um, where we recognize shifts in psychological well-being amongst people. And we use that as a diagnostic criterion. It's like what we say diagnosis is to sort of inform policy. We also need insurance companies to reimburse our monies first. So then we would ask them to give us our money back. And we also inform public health surveillance as a result of these things. But also, it positions us in the forefront of identifying emerging mental health concerns in our communities. And out of one of these is what I'll be talking about. So about 2 years ago, most clinical psychologists in Ghana noticed a trend. And the trend was that we started diagnosing in wholesale generalized anxiety disorders and depressive disorders, but most of them were quite related to the climate and environment and environmental destruction. So we're quite interested. You corroborate this information with other colleagues, and they'll tell you, yes, we're seeing this in a lot of our sessions, but we just don't know what it is. Interestingly, it also coincided with a surge of youth-led demonstrations all around the country, also around environmental destruction and climate change. So then we needed to understand this. And to this, I started working on my project with Professor Monica dos Santos at the University of South Africa to understand what was happening and how we could develop climate resilience through psychological capital and mindfulness. So as we know, Hayes worked on the direct and indirect impacts of climate change on our mental health. And you look at the direct impact being the trauma from weather events, but such as floods and droughts, and then you look at displacements, people from their homes and livelihoods and communities, as well as heat-related stress that affects cognitive function and all that, right? But then the indirect impact would also look like eco-anxiety, climate grief, so nostalgia, all those negative emotions that are associated with it. More important to this is the systemic strains that happens as a result of climate change and climate anxiety, all the climate emotions. Because you find in it community fragmentation, which in and of itself leads intergenerational conflicts where people feel like previous generations haven't been great at keeping our environment for us. And because of that, they feel aggrieved by the way they handled our society, as well as erosion of cultural practices that are tied to our land and our sense of self. And in this, we can see a loss of the ability to self-regulate by most people that live in places that are directly affected by climate change and climate problems. So what's the Ghanaian lens? So in Ghana, what you'd find is coastal erosion and around cities like Accra and Adan, all those communities become flooded, and there's loss of livelihood and people that live off of the livelihoods they get out of the sea and all that. And then you've got erratic rainfalls, also because we depend, now agriculture directly depends on these rainfalls and all that. It threatens our food security and economic hardships that exacerbates mental health problems. And then you've got desertification and extreme heat conditions. Now, desertification causes people to migrate down south, which causes the people down, of course, migration also causes a lot of people having to converge in those cities that have to host these migrants. And then as a result, it comes along with psychological strain as well. Illegal mining has now also become like a national security threat now because these illegal miners poison rivers and degrade the environment so that it affects the total well-being of our communities. These are just strike actions that go around in our country all throughout this year and last year. And just to exemplify these concerns. Now, the neglect on mental health is so grievous, especially in areas like Ghana, because we only commit like 3% of our budgets to mental health. But then also there's the stigma that exists, and then the overwhelming nature of public health concerns that mental health just gets relegated in the background. So then I'll talk to you about the faces of distress and the people that we've met in therapy that have exemplified these things. So for instance, um, I use a pseudonym for this. So Kweku is a 24-year-old graduate whom I met in therapy. And he worked in climate settings, and he actually had a deep understanding of climate science, but also showed presenting symptoms like traumatic stress symptoms, depression and anhedonia, and an identity confusion. And he talked about um, panic attacks, feelings of hopelessness and rage, and strained relationships because he would also talk about climate-related arguments with people. He says, I feel something bubbling in my chest whenever I engage in conversations with people. and he would title, they will call them dummies because they don't understand this. He questions whether he to have children and whatnot. Now, in an 8-week session with Kweku, we understood our sessions were predominantly on mindfulness-based therapies that helped him sort of have a present moment awareness of what was happening around him. And then we also tried to use thought diffusion to sort of help him stop catastrophizing without fusing with them. And then we use body scans and breath work to also help identify and manage climate-related stresses. Now, the outcome of our therapy with Kweku was that he developed self-regulatory skills to cope with his anxiety, and I'll show you that in a minute. Now, our next patient I'll talk about is Eva, who was a fish smoker from Adan, whose job got um, destroyed just because of repeated flooding that destroyed his home and his fish smoking business. Now he relocated to Accra, and because of that, she would have like flashbacks from the flood, was hyper vigilant during rainfalls, and would show signs of depression and anhedonia, was consistently resentful towards his home family, and would disconnect from his community, and had passive suicidal ideations also because of that. Now, with regard to intervention, we resorted to a trauma-informed stabilization, where safety planning was adapted, and we used grounded techniques to help her during her flashback. And then we used grief work to validate her multiple losses to her home, her livelihood, her community, her identity as well. And we explored continued connection to coastal identity despite displacement. Now, in the course of this 6-week sessions, consistent sessions with Eva, we noticed that her trauma had significantly reduced, and she had resorted to using her skills to also help people that were displaced in her community, and also sort of also help in the fight against climate change. And you note I cannot return home, but I can help others survive. Now, the nexus is that mental health, we've noticed that people have a problem with self-regulation these days. And it's actually tied closely to how mindfulness based therapies are actually being eroded from our therapeutic interventions these days. So then we manage these things with emotional regulation, where we manage eco-anxiety with suppression or overwhelm, without suppression or overwhelm. And then we create spaces between climate information and emotional reactivity. And then try as much as possible to incorporate present moment experiences and grounding techniques that manage people when they panic throughout their anxiety and the expression of the anxiety symptoms. And then we also clarify values that individuals actually use, and then we actually cultivate climate activism in a meaningful and sustainable pursuit. We use body scans as well, so that people can have a grounded experience of self-awareness. Now, close to mindfulness is our spiritual ecological connection. And in Dr. Hickman's calm voice, she will tell you that values are attitudinal change is actually rooted in values in a TED Talk. And so in these things, we emphasize how value-based approaches can rope in affect, and how that can in and of itself fight against climate change and climate-related negative emotions. So we emphasize how the land is sacred, and how we not merely are people that just use the environment, but then we have an intergenerational obligation. And then we loop into the conversation, using our language as a tool to help people manage their stresses properly, and manage their anxieties properly. So then, proverbs like in Africa we say, the rain doesn't just fall on one roof, sort of to also emphasize how we can collectively use coping mechanisms and resilience together rather than individual approaches. So in all this, we normalize and reframe the challenges that we all go through, and then manage climate anxiety properly. Now, in psychological capital, which is a concept developed by Luthans in 2007, looks at hope, efficacy, and resilience. So he titles that The Hero Within. Now, in hope, It entails the goal-directed actions and energy with multiple pathways that help to achieve these goals. Now, in this context, it means we believe in solutions that and identify personal contributions to these things. And as a therapeutic stance, what we do is help people to sort of map out what they are doing in their own selves to contribute to the fight against climate change. For efficacy, we try to understand how a person understands the values that they place in there, and then how we can be able to challenge these values. So then in efficacy, sorry. So then in efficacy, we adopt mechanisms that allow a person to adapt, cope, and contribute to climate actions and the things that we talk about. Like in the case of Kweku, he's a climate activist. So then the actions were tailored towards how he can contribute to climate action and help further advance resilience amongst people. And then in resilience, which is the ability to bounce back, we talk about how a person or individuals can recover from climate-related losses and maintain functioning amongst these things. But of course, psychological capital is a growing concept which also is looking at forgiveness, wisdom, gratitude, patience, all these attributes that are geared towards helping people sort of maintain balance and also maintain resilience through a changing climate, growing changing climate. So the toolkit looked like this. So we had hope mapping, where we adapted skills and agency and motivation to try and go through these things. So then the things that the person is doing or the contributions they've been making towards the climate change, all those small, would be mapped against the general things that are going on in the climate, like the direct impact and all that. And then we also had optimistic framing, where we look at the pessimistic side of it and then sort of pair to all the optimistic aspects of it, highlighting successes that we've chalked throughout climate change and climate action, and then see if we can develop more motivation to encourage these things as they go on. Now, what we're doing as therapists in Ghana is we're trying to, as much as possible, enter into stasis. So then on Thursdays, there's a cafe that opens that does these trivia quizzes. So then we try as much as possible to put in these conversations on climate change to help people and the youth sort of adapt. But there's more work that has to be done. So in community facilitation, for instance, we're trying as much as possible to get people to train first responders that help with managing eco emotions and eco anxiety, also through local languages and cultural narratives to normalize the distress. And then we also use proverbial wisdom that also in therapy to try and as much as possible relate to these discussions. Because again, these are not just happening to people that are educated, but uneducated people as well. And then you've got peer support, which is also quintessential towards trying as much as possible to encourage practical solutions towards climate change and climate action. And then we adopt faith-based partnerships where we go to churches to talk about these things. We go to mosques and engage and ask pastors and whatnot to engage in sermons that ensure that at least we are grounded in our environment and we try as much as possible to keep our environment safe from climate-related stresses. So we also use secondary school eco clubs to channel student anxiety, into tangible actions like tree planting and recycling, so that these people can also at least know that they are trying towards making an impact towards climate change and climate action. So what we are asking for from our side of the world is that we have policy integration that incorporates mental health into climate plans, so that it doesn't just become economic and infrastructural thing, but also emphasizes the mental health aspects of climate change, and also ensure that we prioritize the mental health and not just the physical infrastructure. We also, as for interdepartmental collaboration, where ministries collaborate and share budget resources for frontline workers and psychosocial first aid during climate emergency. And then we also talk about how we create funding and secure funding towards mental health services and community programs and psychological capital trainings that help address psychological distress, especially in times of crisis. And then evaluation metrics that help also in our own local languages that help us understand the nexus between climate change and mental health aspects, and also effectively channel interventions towards these things. So then we ask for a holistic approach where researchers, NGOs, and media and private sector collaborate and co-design tools that help deliver psychological interventions in times of crisis, and also supports people that go through mental health as aspects as a result of climate change. And the truth is that from here, a lot of issues go on, and we ask questions like, how do we balance urgency about climate impact without avoiding the overwhelm? How does the media talk about climate change without necessarily forcing people to panic in these things? And the question is not whether we can afford to address climate-related mental health. The question is whether we can afford not to. Thank you very much for your audience.
Thank you very much, Thomas. What an extraordinary set of concepts, and one that really struck me was the need for financing. It's so difficult to convince the people who hold the purse strings to allocate funds for things that they can see. I imagine it must be difficult to do it for things that are perhaps more visible and maybe also not necessarily believed in the same way as a broken leg or a drowning. So thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with us and giving us some very concrete examples of young people in your country. My sincere apologies, everyone. I accidentally switched our two speakers around. So we should have been hearing from Thomas at the end, but we've had his presentation. So my apologies, we didn't follow the agenda. I would now like to welcome Professor Deliwe Petlu to speak. She is from Sefako Mkhatho Health Sciences University, and really very honored to have you with us today as the head of Department of Nursing Sciences at the School of Healthcare Sciences at the university. Professor Petlu is a seasoned academic and leader who served on things like being the program director for the Global Fund for TB at the TB HIV Care. At TB HIV Care, she's held multiple strategic and leadership roles at the University of the Western Cape, including the head of the Centre for Teaching and Learning Scholarship, the head of clinical programs, and the head of teaching and learning. And I'm really pleased that you've contributed with numerous masters and doctoral candidates and still supervised today, despite what I imagine is a very busy schedule. So thank you so much for being with us today, and over to you for us to hear what you would like to share with us.
Good afternoon, yes. I think so. Good afternoon, colleagues on the platform. Good afternoon, everybody. And I think it's an honor for me to be invited to present in this webinar. I really appreciate it, because then is a thought that we're going to share. I'm actually a community health nurse, as you've heard that I work in the Department of Nursing. I'm a community health nurse and a mental health nurse, which, as you will understand as a community health nurse, priority is to make sure that the communities really look after being from a preventative aspect of things. And I'm going to quickly talk to you in the next 15 minutes on the youth mental health in the era of climate change. And this is basically part of the work that we are working with the team that I will touch on at the end of the study, and in which the idea thereof is to have interventions that really are grounded in the approach, the African approach. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to be discussing with you is looking into the critical nexus threatening Africa's future, which is the climate emergency and mental health on its youth, because as whether we want to talk about it separately or we could have had the speakers here really dovetailing into how these two work and how they actually influence the impact on the youth. Then we move beyond diagnosing the problem to unveil a solution already woven in the continent's cultural fabric, because that is what our program or the project that we are working on is really looking into. How does culture and impact the whole mental health issue within the African context? And I'm very glad that I'm actually dovetailing on the previous two speakers who literally set the planes for us, and we used their work, to be quite honest, when we conceptualize the project that we're working on. And then I'll explore a Pan-African framework for resilience and just touch on a case study to illustrate both the profound challenges and the transformative potential of this approach. So this is where we really want to be looking at as the group that is working on this project. And I must say, maybe just to highlight that the group is made out of colleagues from Ghana, colleagues from Tanzania, and the youth in all these three countries that we're working on. Now, what I want to bring to you is that, you know, Africa's reality, the reality that we are looking into, is that we contribute less than 4% of emission, yet we are disproportionately impacted. There is a dual crisis which is unfolding, which is the realities that we're talking to or that we are living in, where there's increased drought in South Africa. We once had a day zero in Cape Town or the Western Cape, where water was extremely becoming problematic. We have intense floods. If you think of the cyclones in Mozambique, if you think of or other areas that have had these floods, including in South Africa also, where we're seeing the weather pattern changes in KZN. And in other areas of the world, if you look into the Horn of Africa, we look up in the African areas, we're looking into where we have extreme drought, and it is impacting different parts of the countries, in Ghana, in other areas where we see these climate realities. And at the same time, we're seeing a mental health gap coverage within the African continent, where about 25% people with mental health conditions does not receive care. So it is something that one needs to think of, or that what are the detailing issues that comes with people who are experiencing mental health care issues and are faced with an additional issue around the crisis on mental health. What then happens? What happens is perpetual echo anxiety that we are in. And I think Caroline nicely spoke about it in detail, what is echo anxiety. And that is what we are seeing within the continent. Next slide, please. So there's a dual crisis. With this dual crisis that we are seeing, I think it's a perfect storm. That with the climate crisis, it's more than a psychiatric, a physical threat. It is, it is a mental issue. We at the same time, besides the climate issue, we are seeing a pandemic among youth in particularly, where there is a growing an epidemic around mental health. We're seeing increase in suicide around the youth. We're seeing all those things, which again, remembering that 75% in the continent does not necessarily get the treatment that is expected. So that's a climate stressor, climate stress has exacerbated a prescribing mental health crisis. And if you remember that in Africa, we are a continent with youth, which 60% of them are under 25. Therefore, this other generation that is going to live in the next years in the world that we has disrupted as the generation that we are in. We're looking into the issues that causes this mental health issue around unemployment. There's a lot of farmland in other areas. There's food insecurity, and there's displacement due to droughts. Next slide, please. So, what is unique to the African youth? Because one can argue that this the climate change impact everybody in the world. Yes, it does. But what is unique with the African youth is the direct trauma, post-traumatic stress from climate-related disasters. There is that direct loss that we see. There's a level of chronic stress and anxiety as it is being presented to you due to eco-anxiety. There's worry about future security, food, water, livelihood as people move to urban areas and there's not enough food, which then has an impact on other people. There's lots of this concept of solastalgia, which was termed by a philosopher Glenn Albrecht in Australia in the early 2000s, which described the pain of homesickness you feel while you are still at home because your environment is being destroyed. You are here, but you are not quite sure what is going to happen tomorrow. And we see that in urban areas, we see them in peri-urban areas, and we see it also in rural areas. So that creates a sense of grief to the young people, particularly in areas where their livelihood is farming, and you one day wake up, you see the land of your father is kind of like destroyed and it is dust. You can't really see the future in it. That creates that pain in terms of where the future is going to be. Because there is loss of identity and there's cultural disruptions, because as you move around in this world, then you get to not know where you are, who you are. You lose those type of things. And the core problem that we actually identified and we are debating is that whether the Western-centric clinical model of mental health for this youth is appropriate. And as it has been shown that if we talk about therapy, we're talking about a therapy that is individual focused, and whereas as an African, we haven't really thought about collective collective worldview is a driver. I have really thought about how are the things, how is my relationship with other people impacting my mental health? How does the climate era, whether am I the only person who's feeling the sting of it as an individual, or is the collective thing? And why is this really problematic? Is that there's also stigma related to it, that you have lost, you are now poor, you are now scared to go. It could be self-stigmatization where you are scared to go and raise issues around that. Next slide, please. So as we talk about that, as a group, we thought about, we are looking into how the mental health of these youth within these areas are tackled. And as I indicated, that it looks like there is a disjunction between the clinical, the Western way of looking at things. And we thinking that, okay, let's look into the lens that we function within as Africans, and to understand that we move beyond the Western and individual-centric models to look into the theoretical lenses that we know that makes us as African, and that the African youth kind of like live with. We're talking about relational well-being is actually a theory that is being used throughout the world, but we're looking into how does this actually shape the well-being, mental health of the youth, because it talks about relationship with people, it talks about the relationship with our place and our past. And we're looking into using the grounding of the Pan-African philosophy, which is basically used in all the countries of Africa, of Ubuntu, where we believe that if we look into how our interdependence and our unity filters on how we do things and how our youth will be able to sustain their livelihood in future. And with that, climate distress is a rupture in their vital relationships, because as people move, we see that rupture happening, and therefore their relationships are broken and we end up being individualistic. So we're trying to say, if we are going to be grounding wellness and well-being and mental health in Africa, we need to be looking into this. And basically, the wisdom of Sankofa, where we use our indigenous knowledge systems to say, how does that impact the interventions that we will be developing in future? Next slide, please. So this is the framework that we are working with. We as I say, that we kind of like taking all these historical issues and looking into what is now known. We're trying to say, if we use this and we test what the community has and what we are strong in as Africans, and we share. We use the history that we have through Ankofa. We have the agency of transforming through collective action. And that is a theory in our program that we are looking to use to test and therefore develop interventions that are applicable. Next slide, please. And if you look into that, we're saying that in pillar one of Ubuntu, Ubuntu in action, it is across the continent we can revive our innate community structures. Things like where we have the Lokotras, we have the Palavahas in other countries, and repurpose them as a space for youth to voice their anxieties, their climate anxieties, their eco anxieties. And by training trusted figures as Ubuntu facilitators, we provide a culturally sanctioned support that reveals the social fabric and reduces stigma at a scale no clinic ever could, because we therefore have agencies and ambassadors who would use what we know and what we are built of. Next slide, please. If you look into the pillar two of our framework, which is Sankofa in action, we're saying that when we look back to our ecological wisdom, in South Africa, for example, this means reviving knowledge of indigenous crops like sorghum. In the Sahel or other farmers managed natural regeneration. And we're looking into these intergenerational programs where we not as much as we are building the mental health and resilience among the youth, but we use the wisdom of the generations before us to make sure that they rebuild the relationships with their heritage, rebuild their relationship with their heritage and their land, instill a profound sense of pride, and therefore have a purpose that is direct antidote to despair. Because once you lose your culture and once you lose who you are, there is a sense of despair that creeps in, and that's what we want to say that could be done differently if you look into the approaches within the context. Next slide, please. And in terms of the agency as a third pillar of the framework approach that we are using, is that when we channel anxiety into collective action, there is a recycling of there is a way of create a bedrock of psychological resistance. So we look into the Pan-African challenges that you have, people become helpless. But if we are using Ubuntu-driven solutions, we foster youth-led, community-benefiting green enterprises, where youth take the lead in terms of what needs to be done, what do they see as their future, Example, when we look into South Africa, right now there are township recycling co-op and community solar projects which are led by the youth. So what we are saying is that if we put the youth in the forefront of how things are done, then we are likely to have youth with more resilience, despite what the disruption caused by climate change in this current era that we're in. So we're saying that if we have ways that we can look into supporting the green enterprises and pushing the African child to not be a side player, but be in the midst of playing within the era of climate change. We have a potential or likelihood of our youth being more resilient because they are not just spectators, but they are part of the solution. Next slide, please. Now, how do we think about this concept that we are in the culturally grounded approach that we are engaging in, or we are putting forward as a trigger for all of us to think? The first thing we want to think as communities as the first responders, and as I say, as I'm an and I'm a community nurse in particular with mental health in training. What we know is that when things are only done within clinics and communities are not involved, they tend not to win. So the first pillar recognizes that the communities is the primary unit of healing. Instead of waiting for a psychiatrist who may never come, in most cases, as we don't have the resources, we need to be training and empower existing communities. The elders, the teachers, and religious leaders in terms of climate change, so that they can lead and this nexus of climate change and the mental health of this youth and build them in terms of their resilience. And the second one, we're saying that the climate crisis, indigenous knowledge the climate crisis can sever the link between generations. Therefore, pillar 2 seeks to repair it. The elders who hold knowledge of drought-resistant crops, they know how these things were done. Water conservation methods that we are not using today, we have lost because of westernization and reading natural science of weathers. So if we can take those lessons that we have received from the elders, then it could help us in ensuring that we really have approaches that works for us and we build resilience within our youth, young generation. Pillar 3 harnesses the innate power of African creation expressions. You know, in Africa, we do storytelling, and in essence, that is what our research is doing. Even the methodologies that we are using methodologies that are more indigenous. We are looking into using arts, and we are using in terms of using photo and narrative story analysis as part of data collection, because people need to feel that this is who we are and this is what we are building. And intervention that comes out of our project are intended to really deal with how we are as a generation of African and the youth of generation translating that knowledge. And finally, we think that the most potential antidote to helplessness is agency. We need to be agent. The pillar 4 focus on channeling anxiety into tangible actions. So when we support youth-led reforestation project, when we support projects that are led by the youth, we are not just doing it for us today, but we are doing it to reduce despair among the youth and ensure that in future they have built resilience and they're able to translate what is happening to them into tangible action. Next slide, please. Just I'm wrapping up in a minute. If you look at the case studies that have already been done, that we think if we learn from them, like the case study that we looked into is a CAMFED, which is a campaign for female education in sub-Saharan Africa. It is a UN climate change program that actually were teaching young women, an initiative where they're teaching combining climate smart agricultural training with peer support education. So what it happens is that as much as people are being taught a skill in terms of climate change, it also gives a space during those programs where youth can sit down and have conversations about their anxiety, about their fears, about their future intentions, and get information that can also help them to say how do they navigate the spaces that they are in. Next slide, please. So we also have a call for action that together we can. If governments come together, if we have partnerships, not work in silos, where we bring in the models of national climate change, adapt within and advise within the African perspective to say, as much as this is the government are using, you're using the policies somewhere else, how does Africa feature into it? Where academics also, colleagues spoke about it, that they are now teaching in the engineering classes. We need to see that happening in Africa too. That climate change is not an environmental issue also, but it permeates health, it permeates every discipline that we teach. And as academics, we need to step up and start talking about this. We need to think of what are how do we influence this policies within the African unions? That does what we do influence how mental health is spoken about, and is it spoken about as an individual concept, and do we ignore how the climate issues are impacting on this mental health? So therefore, we need to be able to have those conversations that goes to those type of level of policy influence. And funders, it has already been spoken about that we need to shift resources and look into community informed initiatives. Next slide, please. I'm closing. In conclusion, the climate crisis is a relational crisis. The solution is relational healing. It cannot be done in isolation. And we believe that when you look into Ubuntu and we look into Sankofa, which talk to African collectiveness while we're using the lens of our previous generation, we would be able to have psychological resilience amongst our youth. We believe that by investing in this culturally grounded approaches, we empower African youth to heal their wounds and themselves, guided by the profound wisdom of their heritage, and not feel lost in the world where everybody has a mindset and their mindset is not there. So hope, mentality, mentally supported youth who are resilient in the era of climate change. That is where our hope is, that if we do that within the approach and within who we are, then we are able to have a generation that we are hopefully is going to be mentally resilient. And this is the current activity that we are working on based on this framework, that we a project that is funded by NRF, HSRC, and Foundation Botma. And this is the colleagues that we are working with, and they range from nurses to sociologists to educational psychologists and nurses who are in mental health practice, those who are dealing with the youth, and importantly, in each country that we are working with different youth organizations, YMCA in Harangwa, the Tolek in Ghana, and as well as in Tanzania. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Deliwe. That was an extremely thought-provoking presentation. My mind was, I caught so many points, and then I sort of drifted into my own world, thinking of how it relates to my own experience. The idea of feeling homesick at home is one that I can resonate with through and through. I lived in the highly air polluted South Durban Basin in KwaZulu-Natal, and there were many, many days where I couldn't understand why I felt homesick at home. and a very heavily polluted environment and a really ugly environment were very depressing and were really unsettling. And I had no idea that that could be anything. So that was news for me. And I love the idea that Ubuntu, which is such a long-standing philosophy and of way of doing things, can be applied in this space. So I think this is really fantastic. Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you today. I'm really pleased to be able to say that we've reached the end of our three presentations, which is time for questions and answers. And I'm happy to moderate that. I believe we do have one question in the Q&A box, so I'll have a look and see what that is and read it. And then I'll call upon our speakers if they would like to react or respond. So this is from Solomon Ritamani. How do you distinguish this anxiety from general anxiety through the life trajectory? And then, is it fair to use terms such as it is immoral and violation of human rights? So, would any of our three speakers like to answer? Please turn on your camera and access your microphone and go ahead. I'm not sure if Thomas or Caroline would like to answer.
Hi. Okay, so on the question, is this anxiety different from generalized anxiety? I think I spoke about how in Ghana, most therapists started dishing out diagnoses of clinical generalized anxiety disorder. The challenge is that most people that experience anxiety have an overwhelming number of issues they talk about when they're talking about the anxiety. So they can talk about their family and they're anxious about getting a partner. They're anxious about the environment. They are anxious about school and work and other things. So then you can sort of lump it all up into there's not a specific anxiety. There's not a direction to this anxiety. The person has a generalized view of the anxiety. It just seems to hit on a lot of issues. But then with this particular anxiety, people that present with it sort of have a focus. They are anxious about the environment. They're anxious about the things that we are doing as people to our environment, especially the human action aspect of climate change and climate work. So it's like, for instance, in Ghana, what we're experiencing is what we call galamsey. It's like illegal mining, and the miners just sort of dig and just leave their pits open, and they leave all sorts of harmful chemicals to the river bodies and all that. And that in and of itself is destroying our environment. So in that, people that go through these strike actions and demonstrations are demonstrating against this particular problem, which is against our environment, the sin that we are committing towards our environment. And that's what they would present in therapy as, hey, I'm anxious, I'm sad about our environment. People would say, our environment is crazy and I don't know what our governments are doing about it. I'm really panicking because like I don't know what's going on. Or like Ava, for instance, would say, these floods are consistently ruining people's businesses. I am a fishmonger without fish. And I don't understand why my livelihood, my work, all of that seems to be ruined by this environmental issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas. It's really true that this is a very focused type of anxiety. I wonder if someone could comment on the idea of this sort of being a violation and, affecting human rights. That was the other comment that was
I'm
made.
happy to start.
Thank you.
But I would invite the other speakers to help me because I would really love to hear as well what your thoughts are on that. I think it's an important segue to look at that relationship between the mental health issue and the actions of powerful others. And Thomas has just spoken about this, Deliway spoke about this beautifully. Both your presentations were So fantastic. This is unique. Humanity, I'll just go back a couple of steps. Humanity has never faced anything on the scale of the climate crisis before. This is the way I think about it. We've faced many, many crises, many, many challenges globally throughout history, but the climate crisis is unique. It is slightly different to these other crises that we face. And there's a couple of things that make it different. One is that it is completely global. It is affecting everything everywhere all at once. And that's unique. We've not had that. The COVID pandemic maybe had some impact around that. But the way we could psychologically even engage with the COVID pandemic was when we get over this, when we get beyond it, when we get on the other side of it, we can go back to normal. We can rebuild. That was the way we create hope for ourselves with COVID, whatever your experience of it was. We can't do that with the climate crisis because the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere, the amount of emissions that's already released, the amount of change that's already triggered means that will continue. So we need a psychological mental health understanding that says we're not going to be able to go back to where we started. We're halfway through the story of the climate crisis. Therefore, it needs a different mental health understanding and framing. And I particularly, I mean, the two other presentations were fantastic, but there's so much spoken about in both of them about resilience, but also about ancestry and roots and community and storytelling. And I couldn't support that more because that's how we can address this in terms of that violation of our human rights. Because I think every generation has an expectation, perfectly reasonably, that their lives will be better than the previous, that we will be moving in that direction. We hope for that. And we can't guarantee that to our children today because of what we've done. So we need something that addresses that and acknowledges what we've done wrong. We need to pay reparation. We need to say sorry to previous generations. There's a brilliant illustration of this online of Jacinta Ardern, who was Premier of New Zealand, who went to the First Nations Parliament to say sorry and beg forgiveness for the indigenous populations, children that were taken through colonialism and racism, taken into orphanages, taken into schools. It was genocide. And she recently, a few years ago, went to their parliament to say sorry, to ask for forgiveness, to ask for reparation. And it was a really crucial healing moment for the community as a whole in New Zealand, that they said sorry for what previous generations and ancestors had done. And there's something crucial about the climate crisis. It is industry. It's primarily white folk that have caused this problem for the rest of the world. And that, in my view, is a human rights issue. And this is a moral violation. And we should say sorry and then take responsibility and be culpable and do something about that. And at COP, there's a lot of discussion about reparation, as there should be.
Thanks very much. That's really helpful, Caroline. Deliwe, do you want to add anything before we move on?
Yes, I wanted to add, as I said in my first slide in the presentation, that as Africa in particular, we contribute less than 4% onto what is happening now. But what is also happening, which in my opinion, it is a social justice issue. It is, if we think about where dumping happens, right? When we look into how I watched a documentary where they were talking about how dumping happens to Africa, clothes being donated that are not actually even needed, and all those type of things that impact ultimately onto our rivers and water stream. Is it a moral issue? Is it okay for us to say that it's okay that we are living in an economy that is more spending money in terms of getting or dumping from the rich countries into Africa. That's an injustice because this is the only continent that we have. So if as a generation that we are living in, right now, we don't advocate for such things. Then our youth, the generation that comes, are not going to find arable land. They're not going to find places where they can literally generate an economy because of how all this dumping that happens into the African continent impact on the land, impact on the climate, and impact on everything that has to do with their future. Should we call it immoral? Maybe we should. Maybe we should put it as that it is immoral for somebody to dump into somebody's space while we are not contributing. Should we call it immoral? Yes, it is immoral that you are now waking up in KZN with pollution when you are not actually the cost of, you are not the polluter. So maybe we should call it as it is. And because this is it is us. I like the whole idea of reparation. It is us who are impacting on the climate when the future is not necessarily ours. We won't be there. So the generation are coming in and they don't have a future. But at the same time, it is also the onus on us to teach them the way of being that is simpler, that is not about always having, and that is, being able to say, how do you sustain and you become self-assured as a young person, even in the face of adversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's certainly not an easy topic to grapple with, but it's really good that we are exposing it now and coming up with potential ideas for solutions. There's another question in the chat. Do you think those who, it's an interesting question. Do you think those who deny climate change, even after overwhelming evidence of this phenomenon, are in a state of denial? And would you call this a coping strategy? I'm not sure whether there's one of our panelists who would like to try and answer that one.
I'd love to.
Okay, great.
I would love to. It is a great question. I agree.
I know Caroline would love to.
It's one of my favorites. But you please come in as well. If you think that human beings are logical, rational creatures, then climate denial can be addressed logically. But human beings are not purely logical, rational creatures, are we? We'd like to think we are, but we're not. If we were, there would be no war, there would be no child abuse. A lot of what drives us mad and creates mental health difficulties is the illogical nature of the world and relationships. So, climate denial, as far as I'm concerned, everyone on the planet has some climate anxiety. Everyone. Unless maybe you're one of the small group of true sociopaths who really don't care. But there's very few of them. I think everyone else has a degree of climate anxiety. But how we deal with that then is different. So some people will deal with it through denial. Some will deal with through disavowal. Disavowal is a bigger problem than denial. With disavowal, with one part of your mind, you say, oh, this is terrible. This is really worrying. We've got to do something about climate change. But with the other part of your mind, you say, yeah, but I'm so happy COVID's over because I want to go shopping for Christmas in New York and I've got 3 holidays booked next year. And you think, how do these two things add up? They don't. So we've got rationality and irrationality. If we were purely rational creatures, we would not have not taken action on climate change. We've had the solutions for decades. So denial is there to protect people about overwhelm. Thomas talked about this beautifully, about the threat of overwhelm. Our risk is either feeling too little about climate change, not having enough anxiety or feeling too much and going into overwhelm and then shutting down and then using things like denial to distance ourselves from overwhelm. We need to be able to feel it. Denial is just there because people often feel guilty and ashamed and they can't bear to face what they've done on behalf of future generations. So it's complex, but there's very little true denial out there. People will just say they're in denial, but they're not really, not unless they are completely uneducated.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your thoughts, and I realize that this is not an easy topic.
Thomas,
So,
say something. Come in, please. Sorry, Carity. I really want to
no,
Okay.
Thomas.
Okay. I have followed Caroline's work for a bit, so then I knew she would answer this. The thing about climate denial is that I mean I remember the first time I experienced some anger related to climate change and stuff was when I wrote a paper with a friend of mine, Aiden, and we're hoping to get that published. And it had been with the publisher for a bit, and then the comments that came back was that why don't we just resort to resignation, and why are we even discussing this? And I was livid. It was my first time being angry about it. But you think about it, it's just learned helplessness. Is that most people just think this is too big to talk about. I don't even know where to start. They say, oh, the ice is melting in the glaciers. It's like, what can I do about it? And so they would rather just, put their hands inside of their thighs, as the Ghanaians would say, and just learn the helplessness out of it. So I think that again, from the one that asked the question, it appears to be people's way of coping. It appears to be people's way of not wanting to contribute because again, there's a loss of a sense of community for most people. So then something happens to the other person, it really doesn't concern me that much. But if we had community that was discussing issues that were happening around ourselves and people would talk about the impact of the changes in climate and how they're anxious about food security, and how Caroline will talk about the impact on the children that we're actually having these days. It will just be a concern for everyone to try and put together resources to help. So yeah, that's my take.
thanks. Thanks very much, Thomas. Given the time, and I was going to just say a few remarks as we wrap up today. There aren't any other questions, so I would like to thank our speakers, our three speakers, colleagues and guests who joined us today for this really important conversation. We've heard powerful insights that really remind us that climate change is not only an environmental, economic issue, but it's also a deeply human issue, and it's one that really reaches into our emotional lives, our identities, our communities, and our sense of safety and hope. We heard from Caroline, who helped us reflect on the emotional worlds of children and young people, how eco-anxiety and grief and fear and uncertainty are emerging as defining features in our time. And Caroline also reminded us that these emotions are not pathological, they're reasonable responses to an unsafe world. So what matters is really how we support young people to process these situations and feelings with honesty, compassion, and with agency, and with resources, because that's also something that came out today. We heard from Deliwe, who really grounded us in African realities, reminding us that resilience is not just a buzzword, because it's used a lot nowadays in different disciplines, but it's a lived, cultural, anchored practice. It was fascinating to hear how we can integrate mental health support into community structures like Ubuntu, education systems, family networks. Then they speak directly to what really is needed for meaningful adaptation. Of course, in the climate change world, adaptation and mitigation are two of the big terms. So, meaningful adaptation on the African continent. And then Thomas, who brought a really critical lens to psychological resilience and spoke about hope, coping strategies, self efficacy, and community connection, all being really important protective resources that can be strengthened. Your work, Thomas and Ghana, really underscores the mental health responses to climate stress and how they must reflect context and culture and lived experience, not just imported models. So for me, across these contributions, I think there's a reasonably clear message. To address climate change effectively, we must treat mental health as fundamental, not optional. We have really heard how emotional well-being shapes individuals and communities in terms of how they respond to climate change, whether they disengage, whether they feel overwhelmed, or if they do take action or show resilience. So I guess we need to find ways to integrate mental health into climate policies. In fact, we need to check if it's even mentioned in the Climate Change Act, which is now operational in South Africa, into school programs, into disaster risk management, and local adaptation strategies, of which many projects are now becoming more and more common. I do want to extend a heartfelt thanks to the Academy of Science of South Africa for creating this platform for this webinar today, and of course to our three speakers for being very generous in your time and your wisdom that you shared with us. Thanks to everyone who joined us today online. It's really, with your engagement, it signals real momentum for change, which is pretty neat. I think we should try and encourage ourselves to continue the dialogue, to think about looking after our own well-being so that we can do it for others, and especially supporting youth in navigating these climate emotions, and really try and advocate for systems that protect our planet, but also the minds of the people who live in it. So thank you once again, everyone, for being a part of this conversation. And yeah, let us try and keep working together towards a healthy, resilient, and more compassionate future for everyone. So thank you very much all, and I look forward to seeing you again at another Academy of Science webinar. Have a good afternoon and take care.